So they showed the official Minecraft movie trailer recently, and we got to see our first glimpse at many cool things, like more B-roll. But more importantly, we got to see the villagers. So today, because I'm far too easily influenced by these sorts of things, we will be making a realistic Minecraft villager that's just ever so slightly cursed. In a good way, I think. Alright, let's start before any regret or shame catches up to me. Alright, so the first thing I'm doing is deciding on the size of my base, so I cut a piece of XPS foam out and set it aside for now while we construct our villager. As always, the first step with sculptures is to make an armature. Truth be told, I'm awful at armatures. For example, this armature here eventually gets its arms cut off since I figured it might be easier to add them after, I don't even know. Now luckily for me, any mishaps at this stage are easily hidden, so I bulk it out with some foil. You know it's done when it starts looking like a metal corn dog, and our escapade with foil is over for now. Next, I'm gonna mix up a dark brown for his villager robes and a skin color for our unholy little freak. And starting with the brown, we're gonna build up roughly where his body will be. I try my best to keep it in a rectangular shape, but I end up smoothing out most of the imperfections and uneven parts of the clay with a blade. This is why while you were fooling around, I was studying the blade, and look where that brought me. Now once it's shaved down, we can move on to the top third of his body and use the skin-toned clay to do the same thing, covering up all the foil and trying to get the general size and shape down. Now, once it's a bit more cleaned up after smoothing all the clay we added together, I cut off a little section at the bottom of his head to act as his neck, and then move on to constructing his face, which is probably the most important part of this whole thing. And to start, I map out his face with some indents to figure out where I want everything to go. And once it looks good, I can use my X-Acto knife to cut out the 2 chunks of clay to make room for his eyes. Once he looks thoroughly traumatized, we can put him aside for now and clean off my craft mat a bit. I take out all the shades of green I might need for his irises and mix them until they look like marble. Now in hindsight, this was kind of a useless step because I end up painting over them anyway, but it's the thought that counts. Then I grab some white clay and start cutting out the shape of his eyes. Once I had 2 nice cube-ish shapes, I start pressing and carving into the center until there's a square indent, which is where his irises will go. I cut out the same size square in that green clay we mixed up, and this was probably my favorite part of the entire craft. I push it in so it covered the entire indented square, and then add a bunch of thin ridges all around the center, and once I have enough, I press a hole into the very center of the green clay and cut out a flat cube of black clay to act as his pupil. I smooth the eye out with some isopropyl alcohol, and then I chucked it in the oven. I did one at a time just to make sure that when it was all baked, I actually made them the right size for his head, which thankfully I did, so I did the same thing for the other eye. When both of them were out of the oven, I realized the green of his irises was a lot more muted than I wanted, so I busted out a few different greens to make his eyes a little bit more vibrant. I actually ended up using my X-Acto knife and a needle tip tool to paint this part more than an actual paintbrush. I wanted to give his irises the same harsh lines of different shades and colors that we have in our own eyes, and once I think they look good, I then paint over the sclera and pupil with white and black respectively. And once I get done with that, they are ready to be implanted into our villager. Now he looks a little bit too angry for me. I kind of want him to have a more neutral expression. So now I'm gonna go around the face and start adding clay to give him defined features, starting with his eyes, mouth, and nose. Now once I have his nose and mouth blended on, I can build out his forehead and cheeks to make his face look less flat. Now this was a fun balance to try and find. I didn't want to take away the signature cubic shape of his head, but I also didn't want him to have really harsh lines that take away from the realism that I'm going for. And speaking of realism, I got into a car crash 3 days ago in real life, so subscribe. That's my call to action for this video, so I hope it works. Anyway, I'm gonna finish working on this half of his face so it matches the other half and the structure of his features really come together. Now, I kind of lost his side nostrils during this process, so I redefined those and then increased the size of his head. Alright, so I know he looks like a weirdly mature baby with his skin this smooth, but we will be adding texture shortly. And once the extra head clay is blended in, I can start giving him some tasteful forehead wrinkles. Of course, he needs 2 ears to hear how absolutely cursed he looks, so I add a little pad of clay to the side of his head, and then I add all the ear wiggly bits. After I added all the details and smoothed it out with some isopropyl alcohol, I kind of realized that it looks a little bit too flat, so I used my X-Acto knife to take out some clay on the inside of the ear and redefined those ear details. Once I finish the first ear, I repeat the same process on the other side of his head. Now that most of his head is done, I'm going to shift focus to his clothing. With the same brown clay that we used for the body, I'm going to texture it with this scrap fabric and cover his entire torso with it. Now I noticed that villager clothes are very simple. The only feature that the basic ones really have is a band of different fabric in the middle, and this just looks like something that separates the robe. I imagine that's how they take it off. Not that I want to imagine that, but anyway. I carved that in, and next up are his arms, and for those I'm using some extra Arm Armature wire, covering it in a little bit of aluminum foil and pressing each end into the torso. Then I cover it in the same brown clay and shape and texture it to match the rest. Now, in hindsight, it might have been a bit smarter to do this before I textured everything, but I love wasting my own time, what can I say? Basically, I blend in a bunch of noodles to his cloak wherever I feel like there might be a wrinkle in the fabric, and then I retexture it with that scrap fabric to blend it in. And while we're on this texture train, let's go back to the face and take away his youthful glow by poking in a bunch of pores and scratching on a bunch of wrinkles. And the icing on this face cake are a few warts, and we can cap off working on the clay side of his face by adding a neckline to the robe. Okay, now on to a step that ended up being almost completely useless, but it looks cool, so I'll show you anyway. And that's using some chalk pastels to make the textures we added really pop. I mix up a few colors and first use a very dark brown to make the fabric texture on his cloak easier to see, and then I use some darker skin shades to make his skin more realistic. When I said this step ended up being almost completely completely useless. It's because this clay I used ended up darkening in the oven enough to basically make everything look invisible. Really the only colors that stayed were the dark red in his ears and mouth, but we'll be adding the extra color with paint later on, so don't worry, I will make sure his skin is as grossly realistic as I can. Now once all the chalk pastel is on, I realized it pretty much all disappeared into the oven. You can tell that really the only color that stayed on were those darker reds. Then I jump scare you with a slightly taller villager because now I'm adding his legs. I don't know why I ended up adding these after we baked him, like they were a completely separate part. I think this goes back to me sucking at armatures and not making it the right height the first time, but you didn't hear that from me. I defined his shoes with my X-Acto knife and texture his pants the same way I did his cloak and then bake him one last time. Once he's out of the oven and all cool, we can start adding details that won't disappear. To texture his skin and make those wrinkles pop, I'll be painting on a pink wash, and for his robe, since that also ended up kind of being ashy, I'll be using a vibrant chocolatey reddish brown wash. As for his shoes, those are gonna get a simple black all over, and once that black dries, I'll be using a gray dry brush to make the shoes look a little bit worn. And finally, we can move on to the two most important finishing details, the unibrow and finishing the eyes. For his glorious unibrow, I got this faux fur here that I used some Mod Podge on the back of, just to keep as much hair on the piece I use as possible. Then I trim it down to size and snip away as much excess fur as I can. I glue the block of fur to his face, and once it's on, I make some final trims to make sure his unibrow fits his face properly, and then I can shift my focus to what's under it. For the eyes, I'm first gonna repaint the scleras white because some pink wash got in them from when I was painting his skin, and then I add thin layers of UV resin until the sunken in irises are filled and his eyes become rounded. Now once his eyes are somehow even more intensely staring into my soul, it's time to work on a simple base for him. For this project, I'm going off the concrete looking floors that were shown in the Minecraft movie trailer, so first things first, I'm gonna split the square into many more squares, and then define each one of them so they all look a tiny bit different. I mix up a good amount of gray paint and give the entire thing 2 coats to cover up the pink. Now once that's done, I'm using the rest of the paint we have left over as a vessel for some baking soda. Mixing in the baking soda to this paint will give us a rocky, gritty texture that's perfect for concrete and also looks like soft serve ice cream, so don't eat it. But I take my time smearing on our rough paint to make sure to each cube, redefining the lines between them if they get a little lost in the paint sauce. Now once the entire base was covered and dry, I mixed up a dark wash that ended up a bit too dark. So once I applied it, I took a paper towel and wiped most of it off. Then I used a much more watered down mix over the rest of the base, and I dry brushed on some super light gray paint to re-emphasize all the bumps. I glued our villager smack dab in the middle, and although I wanted it to be simple, I didn't want it to be this simple. So to bring back a little life to the base, I'll be sprinkling on some super fine turf in the cracks and crevices, as well as gluing down a good amount of these miniature leaves. Alright, and with that, I think it's time for the final reveal. A set of final shots so good it makes you go, And as always, I have to give a gigantic shout out to all of my patrons. Without them, the lanterns in this village would be dark, so I am eternally grateful for their support. I also want to remind everyone that if you didn't see my last community post, I was asking for names for the plant that survived the car crash with me, and you guys suggested gems like Nokia, Crumple Zone Tyrone, and I threw in some suggestions myself like Crash Bandapalm and just straight up car crash. So when this video gets posted, I'm throwing up a poll on my community tab, so go and vote for your favorite name for the car crash plant, and I'll announce the results in a week or two. But yeah, thanks for entertaining this Minecraft mood I've been in. I'm kind of tied on the next craft. I either want to make something Shadow the Hedgehog related or Jeff the Landshark from Marvel Rivals, so let me know which one you would prefer, and I will see you guys next time. Drive safe.